Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, verses 27 to 32. And you have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell. And it was also said, "Whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce." But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. This is the word of the Lord. Well, last week we began walking through these concrete examples that Jesus starts to give us in the second half of Matthew 5, right? These things that he tells us in verse 20 that our righteousness must exceed that of the scribes and the Pharisees so that we can enter the kingdom of heaven. And then he immediately goes into what we could call practical, concrete examples. And also remember, and you see this at the top of the handout there, you notice the handout is not only fill in the blank again this week, but has a front and back. I'm sorry, that's on me this week, guys. But that's all right. But you see there at the top of the handout, we've got this guiding question of what does it mean to be human? What does Jesus reveal to us and embody for us about what it means to be fully and truly human? Basically, what were we created to be, and how are we meant to actually live as God made us? Right? And so because of that, Jesus is not giving us these practical examples in some kind of abstract way. Right? He's revealing what the blessed life looks like, the Makarios life, right? The Beatitudes, the flourishing life. Here's what life is meant to look like. And he's showing us that the exceeding righteousness that exceeds the scribes and the Pharisees reaches into our telos, our purpose of being, our goal, the reason for which we were made. And so again, last week he began with this commandment against murder, but then he moved very quickly from the physical act, "You shall not murder," to the interior disposition of the heart. Anger, speech, contempt, imagination, all these things these ways that we might receive someone, that we might perceive another person, that we might identify another person, another fellow believer specifically. And he does something very similar with that this week with lust and divorce. And so like with anger, this text sounds sort of, if you just approach this haphazardly, it sounds kind of like the Jesus approach to sexual ethics, right? That's how it's usually been even taught. So things as simple as, you shouldn't lust, which is a good idea, right? Don't cheat on your spouse. That's a good idea. Don't get a divorce. Again, it's a good idea. But like last week with anger, what if Jesus is showing us what disordered desire does to our whole being? Maybe that's really what he's getting at. What if these are not two disconnected teachings, which is why I asked Connor to make sure that both of them were together in the text today. That's the point I'm going to make. These are not two disconnected teachings. They're actually two windows into the same fracture of our humanity. Because Jesus, you notice very quickly, he uses very violent language in this teaching on lust. Cut off your hand. Rip out your eye. That's pretty vicious language. But then you read it and you're like, why does he use this language? Well, actually, before we even get to the first point, you've got 3 blanks there. I'm going to give them to you right now. Here's why I think he gives us this violent language. It's because he knows that desire is not just something that we feel. Feel is your first blank. Desire is not just something that we feel. Desire informs what we think another person is for. For is your second blank. Desire informs our understanding of another person's telos. of their purpose, of what they were created to be. So like last week, the question is not so much, have I committed adultery, right? Last week we asked, well, it's not so much, have I murdered? But this week is the same. Have I committed adultery? That's not the question. Or even, what is and isn't lust? Or even, what are the right rules about divorce? That's not the real question at play here. The real question at play here is, and you see it there on the handout, what is disordered desire doing within me to affect the way that I see and treat fellow image bearers? And so he starts out, and we see the pattern very quickly. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So like last week, this is a recall of one of the 10 commandments. This is the 7th commandment, you shall not commit adultery. And that word adultery is obviously very intentionally chosen, because not only is Jesus returning to the law itself, he's returning to its heart and its spirit. He's making a very specific point about desire, about disordered desire. The Greek word, and as always, I'm going to butcher these Greek words because I'm from Mississippi, and Walton comes from a different part of Mississippi, so he speaks better than I do. But but I'm going to butcher these words, so you can correct me afterwards for those that know Greek a little better than I do. But the Greek word he uses here is moicheia or moikeia, which this word really leaves no wiggle room or gray area for what Jesus means. So this is not desire in a generic sense. He's not talking about, and this is really important because we come to this idea of lust and we might think, well, we can lust for things other than just another person. That's really a downplaying of what Jesus is teaching here. This is not a lust for money. This is not a lust for influence or for comfort or for power or for status. This is explicitly sexual in nature. So let's just be uncomfortable again this morning, right? Last week, talking about anger makes us uncomfortable. Let's be honest, guys, talking about sex makes us uncomfortable. But this is explicitly sexual in nature. And your next blank here is this. This is an intentional violation of the marriage covenant. Violation is your blank. So this is sexual desire that is directed towards someone who does not belong to us. And we've really got to identify it and name it for what it is, regardless of how uncomfortable we are to talk about it, regardless of how much our modern sensitivities, although they have definitely gone a lot further astray than what they even were when I was a kid. But we have to talk about it because it's important for us to grasp this lesson if we're going to understand what Jesus is teaching us about what it means to be fully human under him. And so he immediately switches from the physical act to the inner disposition in verse 28. You've heard it was said in the commandment from Moses, but I say to you, if you look at a woman with lustful intent, you have already committed adultery in your heart. Now, obviously, this can go back and forth. If you look at a man, ladies, with lustful intent. If you look at another person with lustful intent, you could make that stretch. That's not downplaying what he's saying. But notice what Jesus is not saying, and this is really important. Jesus is not saying that noticing another person's beauty or even having a passing attraction to someone is the same thing as adultery. That sounds a little odd to us, but that's not what he's saying. Because think of it this way. If this were the case, then simply thinking someone is pretty or someone is handsome would make us guilty of adultery. That's not the same thing, right? I mean, I think Craig is very pretty, but I have not, I'm kidding. That's a joke. He's back this week. I can make fun of him. No, I'm kidding. But that's not the point, right? What Jesus is saying, and here's your next blank, he's saying that the root of adultery is lustful intent. And that word lust literally means, and you see it here, it means to desire, to long for, or to covet. So what Jesus is actually doing in the first 2 verses of this teaching is he's bringing 2 commandments from Moses now into this teaching. So it starts out with the 7th commandment, but now he brings in the 10th. You shall not covet. List, but you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. But even more specifically, and here comes your next blank, this phrase of lustful intent has the sense of purposeful looking, or looking in order to possess. Possess is your blank. If you look at someone in order to possess them, you are looking with lustful intent. I see you and I want you for myself. Now, this informs what we are willing to justify in how we treat another person for whom we are lusting. It tells us a lot about what we think about their purpose, about their telos. So the issue here is not simply that we see someone's attractive qualities, right? You're all very beautiful and very handsome. But the issue, and here comes your next two blanks, the issue is that lustful intent trains our imaginations to see another as an object for our use. Trains, object, and use are your three blanks. Lustful intent trains our minds and our hearts and our souls to see another person as an object for my use. I want to possess you and use you for my pleasure. And that's it. So lust missees the person. You see this even just as the heading. Disordered desire missees the person. Lust looks at an image bearer and begins to imagine that person apart from their dignity and apart from their covenant context and apart from their telos before God himself. And so lust receives a person not as a person, but as something for me to have for myself. You can see the problem very quickly. So disordered desire only asks, how can I use this person for my pleasure, for my desire, for my lusts? And that changes what we imagine about them in our hearts and in our minds, and what we excuse by way of treatment, and even what we think we're entitled to from them. So this is why we can't treat lust as harmless. Now, lust may be private in the sense that no one else can see it in the moment, right? But let's not assume that lust is not doing something within us and to us. It's training our eyes and our imaginations and our desire to receive another person as less than they are. Because notice where Jesus immediately places the responsibility for lust. And I think we all miss this point when we talk about this topic, right? I grew up in the late 90s. I was born in the 80s. I grew up in the 90s. And I imagine this probably even goes back some as well before me. But in this period that was called the purity culture of Christianity, I went through youth group and we had the Promise Keeper stuff. And I forget, it was one that we did. I forget, it was really popular for a long time. You even got a promise ring that you have. Because I promised to Jesus to be chaste until I was married. It was a big deal to try to tamp down on premarital sex, right? But usually those conversations turn to modest is hottest. I guarantee, I promise you 1,000%. We sold a T-shirt at Lifeway when I worked here that said modest is hottest. I'm not kidding, right? Dress modestly. Now that's important, but that's not what Jesus is getting at here. Because notice what he says. He places, and here's your blank, he places the responsibility upon the one who is lusting, not on the one that has caused me to lust. And that's really important. He doesn't say if someone causes you to lust because of how they're dressed or how they're acting or etc., then they are guilty for your lust. That's not what he says. That's a whole different issue. It's an issue of itself. It's a whole sermon in itself if we want to make it that way, or a study. But the issue is what my disordered desire is doing within me to affect the way that I see and treat someone who is an image bearer of God himself. And here is the next point, and this is the next blank. The issue is the responsibility is on you because someone else is not responsible for your sin. That's Jesus' point. St. John Chrysostom notes here and he says this. He says, we cannot blame external factors for other people for our inner consent to sin. I can't blame what's going on in the world for my sin-sick desire to sin. So if lust disorders our desires toward a fellow image bearer, and in particular another Christian, because keep in mind, the context of this sermon is to the disciples, to the community of faith that Jesus is building. If lust disorders my desires toward another person made in God's image and another believer, then how do we combat it, right? Because that's the hard question, right? This is the question that, as silly as it is to look back and kind of poke fun at it now, the purity culture in which I grew up in the youth era, in my youth, it was still trying to ask this question: how do we handle this? How do we deal with this? How do we teach our children and our teenagers to struggle through this? What do we do? Paul's words in 1 Timothy 5 are really helpful. The context is a little different, but they're actually really helpful. He encourages us to receive older men as fathers, younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, and younger women as sisters. But then he says this, he concludes that verse, which is verse 2 of 1 Timothy 5. He says, do so in all purity. In other words, and here are your final two blanks in this section, the church is meant to be a community where we learn to see one another according to communion. Communion is your blank. According to communion rather than consumption. And this is really the point we were harping on last week in relation to broken communion because of anger and murder and contempt in our heart and our desires. So lust, like anger, breaks communion between one another and the way that we worship and between us and God. It breaks communion because we have misperceived, we've misseen another person. But then he goes on. And he says, so if your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away, for it is better that you lose one of your members than your whole body be thrown into hell. If your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away, for it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell. This is the violent language, right? This is pretty vicious language. But it's also intentionally hyperbolic, meaning that it's an intentional overstatement for emphasis. And Jesus uses hyperbole a lot throughout his teaching. He does it in order to make a point, but to also honestly keep us from just falling asleep while he's teaching, right? So just consider, for the sake of argument, right? Very early on, you get the impression, understandably so, both in anger and now even in the first couple of verses of lust, that what Jesus is doing is he's just reaffirming the Ten Commandments, but he's reframing them in order to help us understand what it means to live in the kingdom of heaven. And so you start to read this and you're like, well, I know the Ten Commandments and I know the law because I've read the Bible and I kind of get what he's getting at. So I'm going to relax a little because I really don't struggle with this. And then he says, you know what? Cut off your hands and gouge out your eyes. That's going to wake you up, right? That's going to get under your skin a little bit and be like, what in the world is he saying? But then let's be clear, and here comes your first two blanks. Self-mutilation would be a violation of the law. So, Jesus is not commanding literal self-mutilation. I'm going to explain what he's saying, but if he was, it would be a violation of the law. We proclaim that Jesus is completely sinless. If he violated the law, that would not be the case, right? So, this would be a violation of the law. This is part of the issue of inner disposition. So if the issue is the disposition of our hearts, then literally tearing out our eyes and cutting off our hands would not fix the problem of our sin sickness. But that said, let me at least also clarify this. His use of hyperbole does not make his teaching any less serious. If anything, it shows us just how serious he's being. He's using graphic language because he wants us to truly grasp how much disordered desire breaks us and what it does to us. He's also, and this is very important, especially in our culture, not just the world culture, but frankly in a lot of the church culture, he is not teaching us to hate our bodies. He's not telling us that the body is evil. That would be Gnosticism. That would be heresy. We are not souls trapped in a body, just trying to get out. We are embodied creatures. Our body matters, and it matters because Jesus took on a body, died in a body, rose in a body, and lives at the right hand of the Father in a body. The eternal Son of God, to this day, has a literal flesh and blood body. The body matters, all right? We all know this. I'm preaching to the choir. But it's an important point to make. So, let's now understand all of this. So this Greek word that Jesus uses for causes you to sin, you see it there, I put it in your handout, is, I'm looking a little too far up. I forgot, it's front and back. I was looking a little too far up in my handout. It's scandalizo, I believe I'm saying this right. It sounds like scandalous, right? This is exactly where our root word for scandalous comes from. This word has the idea of being tripped or entangled. Other translations might read, makes you stumble instead of causes you to sin. So, this is not merely something that offends us or bothers us. Right? This is, and here's your blank, this is a stumbling block. We all know what it's like to trip over our own feet when we're walking on a flat surface, right? But imagine you only have one way to go and you have a 40-foot block in the way. You're going to trip and fall, right? It just is what it is, right? This is a stumbling block. This is something that causes you to fall into sin or even to lose faith. And so he says, if that thing that causes you to sin, if that scandalous thing, that scandalizo thing is your right eye or your right hand, then tear it out. Rip it off. In this culture, the fact that he identifies it as right hand and right eye is very important, because in a lot of cultures around the world today, the left hand is the dirty hand. You can take that to where you want to take it. I'm left-handed, so I'm dirty-handed, right? I am a southpaw as long as the day is long. Can't help it. It was not beaten out of me in school, right? We were past that by the time I made it to school. Right? My grandmother was not so fortunate, but that's not the point. But in this culture, the right things were symbolic of the most important things, the most valuable thing to a person. What's useful, what's treasured. So take that into what Jesus is saying here. In effect, he's not saying get rid of the things that you were already going to get rid of in your life. If you were already going to get rid of it, it no longer holds value for you. It no longer has influence over what you think about, what you imagine, what you're going to do with your life. No, what he's saying, he says, look, if something is precious to you, if something is deforming your desire, if something is training your heart and your mind to see someone as useful only for your pleasure, then you need to lose it or it will lead you to hell. That's his point. And so the point, and here comes your next blank, is not hate your body. The point is cast away whatever's training your whole person, your body, your soul, what is training your whole person away from God. Away from God are those three blanks. And that could be a habit. It could be an image. It could be a fantasy. It could be an excuse. If you want to get really practical, I'm not going to harp on this long, but you get where I'm going. It could be a luxury. It could be a device. It could be whatever it might be. That private pattern that you keep telling yourself is harmless because no one else sees it. It could be that. But Jesus says you need to rip it out. You need to cut it off. You need to throw it away because it will lead you into hell. And that's not to shame us. It's not to shame us or humiliate us, because he wants to restore our humanity to what we were created to be. We don't call Jesus the second Adam for no reason. Paul doesn't call him the second Adam for no reason. He calls him that because he is humanity restored and redeemed. And so this demands that we ask a very uncomfortable question of ourselves, right? Which is, what is precious to me that's disordering my desire? What's causing me to missee a person, to want to use them for my own pleasure or to possess them for myself? What needs to be ripped out and cut away? Here's your last two blanks. Jesus attaches eternal significance. Eternal is your first blank. He attaches eternal significance to what we often want to keep hidden. Hidden is your next blank. Because again, he mentions hell here. Gehenna is the word in Greek. If you want to go extremely literal, there was literally a trash heap outside of Jerusalem where things were burned, and that was called Gehenna, but the illustration and the symbolism is important there. It means judgment. It means hell. It means things that are burned and destroyed. And not because every temptation means that we're beyond mercy, but he attaches this eternal significance to how the things we keep hidden, because what we do with our desire and with our bodies has eternal significance. The body matters. And then he feels like he shifts gears, but he doesn't. He then says, but it was said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So, again, as I mentioned as we got started this morning, I don't think these are two disconnected teachings. I think they're two windows into the same problem that Jesus is addressing here. Two sides of the same coin. And again, it feels like a new section, but I think Jesus is showing us where disordered desire eventually leads when it goes unchecked. So here's your first blank. If lust, this is on the back now, if lust missees another, then wrongful divorce discards another. Now, just because if you're not married, this does not mean that this does not apply to you, right? Because if your lust is misseeing someone, once you have used them for your pleasure, you're discarding them, right? This is how you can apply it. But in both cases, the person is no longer received as a whole person with dignity or importance or to their telos. And so like with lust, instead they become someone I can use and then dismiss and replace when my disordered desire wants to. I've used you. I no longer desire you. You no longer mean anything to me. Your use is done. And so the context that Jesus draws upon here isn't the Ten Commandments. He draws upon Deuteronomy 24, where Moses begins to lay out the laws concerning divorce. And he draws upon this same teaching again in Matthew 19 when the Pharisees come and they try to test him on divorce. The Greek word, I thought this is really fascinating. You see this here. The Greek word he uses for certificate of divorce is apostaseon. I believe I'm saying that right. Now, technically it is the legal document or the paperwork or the certificate that marks the separation, right? You hand them a certificate of divorce. You hand them an apostaseon. That word, and most of you already know this, that word shares the same root with the word apostasy. I find that interesting. I don't know how much to really dive into that here, but I think it's kind of interesting. Apostasy means to abandon the faith. But I don't think that connection is arbitrary. I think it speaks to a very intentional covenantal rupture, right? The covenant of marriage has now been ruptured. The abandonment that takes place when disordered desire goes unchecked. Just like you would abandon your covenant with God because you have apostatized, you're apostatizing from your marriage. I think that connection is intentional. And so Jesus notes in Matthew 19, he says, look, the purpose of the law was to regulate divorce in a fallen world. It was to hopefully limit the damage done, particularly to a woman in this culture who would be left in a state of legal and social limbo. So it's meant to be protective, but it's also because of your sin. But what Jesus, and you notice this here, what he refuses to allow for, and this is really important, what he refuses to allow for is for that regulation of divorce in the law of Moses to become a loophole or a legal permission structure to become a way of making covenant betrayal look righteous. This is what the Pharisees were getting at. Well, Moses let us divorce. You're trying to make divorce righteous, and that's not the point. Paperwork can make betrayal look orderly. I've gone the legal route, but it cannot make betrayal holy. And that really is the problem that Jesus is confronting. He's protecting the vulnerable, but he's also confronting our own desire, our own disordered desire here. So he's defending covenant faithfulness, he's protecting the vulnerable, he's exposing the kind of technical righteousness that would say, I followed the letter of the law while ignoring the one that is wounded by this betrayal. So again, he's not giving us a full divorce and remarriage policy in these two verses. He's showing us that covenant faithfulness cannot be reduced to legal technicalities. And that's what makes this what we could call an exception clause in verse 32 really so important, why it matters so much, because he says, I say to you, everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality. The word that he uses for sexual immorality is, and you see it there in your handout, it's the word porneia, right? It's where we get our word pornography. In this context, and here's your next blank. I'm finally giving you another blank. In this context, now porneia can mean a lot of things, all right? So think of every possible sexual immorality you can think of, right? All of it can be wrapped up in that word porneia. But in the context that he's teaching of here, it actually speaks to sexual unfaithfulness within marriage. Because notice, not only does he say sexual immorality, but he says, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. This is how we're all the way back at the beginning, because that word adultery is the same word that we looked at the start of this. This is why these two are connected. That's part of the reason why they're connected. But this sexual unfaithfulness within marriage, Bonhoeffer is actually really helpful here. He talks about this a little bit in The Cost of Discipleship. He says this. He says that the body of the disciple belongs to Christ and discipleship. It's what our body is for. Belongs to Jesus, belongs to discipleship. He says our bodies are members of Christ's body. And because Jesus, the Son of God, assumed a human body, we've already established all this, right? Because Jesus, the Son of God, assumed a human body, and because we are in communion with his body, this is why porneia, this is why sexual immorality, lust, and adultery is a sin against the body of Jesus himself. So in other words, what Bonhoeffer is getting at, what he helps us to see what Jesus is teaching here, is that porneia is not a technicality. It's not just a category in the divorce debate. It names a real violation of embodied discipleship. The body of the Christian belongs to Christ. So, and here's your next blank. Sexual unfaithfulness is not merely a failure to keep the marriage covenant. It is a rupture of what bodily faithfulness is meant to bear witness to the world. Bodily faithfulness is meant to bear witness to one another, what we mean to one another, but also, as Paul teaches in Ephesians 5, our marriage is a literal parable to the world of Christ and the church. So when we commit sexual immorality and divorce wrongly, it's telling the world that Christ and his church doesn't matter. Take marriage seriously, right? And that's why these two texts go together, because disordered desire does not stay private. That's an important point to keep in mind. Disordered desire doesn't remain locked away in our imagination. It might begin with the eye and go into our imagination and in our hearts, but eventually it touches bodies, and it touches marriages, and it touches households and children and friendships, and then it creeps out like a cancer into the community. It destroys lives and churches and relationships. Our sin, and that's your next blank, sorry. Our sin is never just ours. And this is part of the danger, honestly, of our individualization of our culture. Your sin is not just your sin. So, to be frank, if you don't get anything else from today, get that point. Your sin is not just your sin. Now, let me at least be clear for the sake of those that are hurting because of divorce, whether you're in the room or you're listening on the audio. This text is not meant to be a weaponization against those who have gone through divorce. Whether you've been abandoned or betrayed or abused, those who have been sinned against, this text is not meant to be used for that. And if anybody is using it for that, then you need to repent. Jesus never crushes the wounded, and he's not doing it here. Right? What this is he's saying, and here come your next two blanks. Lust wounds communion between people, between one another, but also between us and God, because it teaches us to use people. Lust wounds communion because it teaches us to use people. And wrongful divorce wounds communion because it teaches us to discard people. Use and discard are your final two blanks. And both of them fracture the community of the faithful. They fracture the community that Christ himself is building, which is a community based on faithfulness to God, but also trust in him and in one another, in truth and in agape love, and in the godly form of love. And so really, in regards to just example, this is where we have to remind ourselves that Jesus is the example. Right? He shows us, again, what it means to be human, what our purpose of being is. He shows us our telos because he is the faithful bridegroom. He will never misuse his bride or discard his bride or abandon his bride when she is weak. He will not abandon us when we're wounded, and thank God he will not abandon us when we're sinful or difficult. He gives himself completely to us and draws us to himself. Christ is our example. So again, as we come to the table, what is disordered desire doing within me? Right? What is it teaching my heart, my imagination, my eyes to see and to want? What is it allowing me to justify? What is it doing to my body, to my relationships, to my covenants, and to the communion of the faith? Whatever it is, beloved, rip it out, cut it off, and throw it away. Not because your body is shameful. Your body is not shameful. Christ has a body. The body matters. But cut it out so that you can be who you were created to be in the Lord Jesus Christ.